Finally, another one of the major issues that came across in all the post-Soviet Central Asian states, and really across the post-Soviet world, was the question of socioeconomic rights. There were lots of questions about private property. Private property didn't really exist in the Soviet Union. It was almost a taboo. Some argued that you needed private property to have a civil society and the basis for effective democracy. But others were concerned about the buying and selling of national assets, especially when they could end up in foreign hands. Right? We finally have independence, but now the foreigners are taking over everything, and this could create essentially a new dependency, a new empire, a neo-colonial order. You can think about this as in sort of well, in a twisted way. You can think about the U.S. fears of China holding on to our debt. And imagine, I mean, that's gotten a lot of press and a lot of discussion in this country. So imagine in a place where you've never had such one foreign interest, but also private property in the first place, and that makes it a lot more, lot rougher. So this was especially the case when it came to land. People felt this was the natural wealth of the country, that land should belong to all the citizens. And again, you've got the ethnic factor here. The Russians or some others will buy it up and leave none for the true titular national ethnic group, which has inherent rights to it. So the ethnicity came to the fore here too. Titulars didn't want to be seen making too many concessions to Russian speakers, since they invested so much in nationalist legitimacy, as I talked about before, this national myth-making process, the creating the nations. So they were really in a tough situation. Ultimately, all the constitutions allowed for private ownership, but none of them allowed for that ownership rule, or the ownership rules that were constructed to apply to land. So land was something very separate, very distinct. And I've seen this in other places, in other countries as well, where land is held out as something very special. There's also the question about socioeconomic rights more broadly. The right to work, the right to food, the right to shelter. Things that are actually embossed within the International Covenant, ICCESCR, the International Covenant for Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights. Something that was always pressed upon by the Soviet Union. They weren't so big on political rights, but they liked to espouse these economic rights. And so now you've got the big question of how much to leave in there. These are costly. Maybe they're not very practical under market conditions. Do you want to guarantee work for everybody, like the old system used to? When at the end of the day, well, if you've got a free market, there's supposed to be some sort of slack. Some big questions. Other questions, what about women who were traditionally left out of the local leadership positions? And this highlights really a cultural aspect of human rights in the region. If the Council of Elders was always composed of men, then should we now force them to allow women members as well, right? Equal members of society. So all these sort of socioeconomic questions came up. So just to summarize here, I'll leave it here. Just to summarize, all these states, newly independent states, chose a presidential system. All but one was adopted through parliament. The most factionalized, oddly, Tajikistan held the referendum. You had major discussions in Kyrgyzstan, but also Kazakhstan. There was practically no discussion in Uzbekistan and Turkmenistan, and not so much in Tajikistan because of the censorship and security situation. So how do the institutional decisions taken by Central Asian leaders affect everyday politics? Well, the sad answer is, and now we're nearly 2.5 decades on, the sad answer is not so much. There's this phenomenon called competitive authoritarianism, where you take power through semi-legitimate means, and then very often increase that power, often through extra legal means, though perhaps with or without support of the population. Doesn't mean you're unpopular, but it means that you use extra legal means to maintain power. And quickly you can become authoritarian. So you end up blocking the opposition completely, for example, by outlawing the opposition. You allow for elections, but most competitive authoritarian states, elections are not particularly free. They're not particularly fair. You have some elements of the opposition, the more loyal opposition, quote unquote, that can go out and campaign. You might have real opposition that can campaign, but they're not going to win much power. Okay, because the system's going to be set against them. They're not going to have media time. They're worst comes to worst, you can just take away their numbers in the official count. So you moved much more away from even the competitive authoritarianism in many of these places to authoritarian regimes. And broadly speaking, we can talk about authoritarian regimes in Turkmenistan and Uzbekistan, and softer competitive authoritarianism in Kazakhstan and Kyrgyzstan, and I suppose sort of a mix, tougher competitive authoritarianism in Tajikistan. So the path wasn't the same in each one of these states, but it was roughly the same direction. So we'll look at this. Let's start by looking at differences in understandings and definitions of democracy. And here are a handful of definitions of democracy that we tend to see. And we tend to look at minimal or mechanistic democracy on the one hand and liberal democracy on the other. So we'll start with these two. This minimal democracy is, again, it's mechanistic, dry. If you've got multi-party elections, hopefully they're free and fair, then you've got a democracy. Okay, so what do we mean by free and fair elections? Well, they've got to be competitive. There's got to be an even playing field for everyone before the elections and during the elections. So in the run-up to the elections, people should be able to campaign, for example, hold major events, etc. You don't have vote rigging during or after the elections, and you've got an enfranchised citizenry, people who are allowed to go out and vote and feel they can vote the way they want to and in private. Now, liberal democracy adds to this concepts like the rule of law, a separation of powers, basic freedoms and liberties, property, speech, assembly, conscience, that are trumpeted more than in these minimalistic or mechanistic democracies. So in a liberal democracy or constitutional liberalism, it's not simply connected with how leaders assume power, but also how they exercise power. The protection of individuals through checks and balances and impartial courts, guaranteed equality under the law for everyone, and the important role of civil society, people continuing to check the government even while it continues to rule, and not just every once in a while. And of course, real checks. Another couple concepts that I want to throw out here are delegative democracy and sovereign democracy, two things that we've seen more in this region. Delegative democracy refers to this trend where the president rises through elections, but then rules in the name of all, unconstrained by the legislature, unconstrained by the courts. And the president can rule, for example, by decree. So delegative, in other words, the president is your delegate, your democratic delegate, and now the president can do what he or she sees fit. It's only been a he in these Central Asian states. And then the last concept, sovereign democracy, has really been popularized by Putin in Russia, but others have taken advantage of this term, in which you're really free to define what democracy is. And any foreign concerns or doubts about how solid the country's democracy might be are really tantamount to interference. And so democracy is as we see it is. Right. That's not, it tends not to be a very solid democracy. It's certainly not a liberal democracy, and it tends not to meet the expectations of a minimal or mechanistic democracy as well. Before we can get here, let me just say a couple more words. Often we, and especially Western policymakers, turn a blind eye to these less appetizing developments. And there are a few reasons for this. In other words, minimal democracy is often something that makes Western policymakers perfectly happy. Liberal democracy is great. Minimal democracy is fine. Delegative democracy, sovereign democracy, we often find ourselves in the policymaking world trying to come up with excuses for them, very sadly. And one of the reasons we do this is because this allows us to have greater relations with them. They can go around domestic constraints, for example. Our own voters might not want us to spend time and money on human rights abusers, but if we think we need them in an alliance, for example, over terrorists, well, we want some flexibility. And this is something that we clearly saw in Central Asia after 9/11. There's also usually the hope that constructive engagement can have a positive influence over time. And I really, having been in the policy world and been in an embassy in Central Asia, I really think that there is this hope that, if we gradually, kick and chip and chip, eventually they'll turn into liberal democracies. There's also another issue, which is that calling them failures has reputation costs for the target state, in other words, the Central Asian state that we're calling a failure, and it really estranges them. And this is, again, a world where we have lots of priorities, economic, security, etc. Do we really want to estrange these folks? And finally, their failure might be our failure. We're out there to help them build democracies, and it doesn't look good if we're not strong enough to actually help them. So there are lots of reasons why you see Westerners turning a blind eye to some of these developments in Central Asia. Now, it's also important to remember that in the 1990s, We actually, and this is when I was actually at the embassy in Uzbekistan, we didn't turn a blind eye. We kicked and kicked and kicked and kicked and kicked on human rights issues, saying, "Hey, you need more democracy, you need more human rights." Was this fruitful? Well, I don't know. It's what I did. It's what I felt was right. It's what I was told to do. But was it fruitful? Probably not, because all the Central Asians ended up doing was moving back towards Russia, where they weren't getting kicked around so much. So all these things are things to think about. But that's sort of like a foreign policy aside. But since we're talking about the terms of democracy, and we're going to move into foreign policy, I figured I'd bring it up. So let's talk about some factors that influence the path of democratization. Let's see how much time we've been. Oh, I'll take that in one more slide.